Hello, friends. Welcome to Through the Glass, episode 6, perhaps? I don't know. It seems like a while. We're humming along. We have not been taken off the air. I want to thank Lakehouse Recording Studios, and I want to thank today's guest, Derek Minno Bloom, resident of Asbury Park, works in racial justice, affordable housing, and is officially the Social and Food Justice Director at Trinity Church here in town. Hello, Derek.
Hey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Tell us a bit, tell the good people a bit about the work that you do.
Yeah. So long story short, I was in Arizona and was moving back east and needed a job. And I just searched social work jobs in Asbury Park and saw the anti-hunger program director at Trinity. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like a church program that has like an anti-hunger, because sometimes I guess people these days don't like to use anti because there's like a negative. You want to do like racial justice, not like anti-racism kind of thing. But anyway, I applied for it and did 5 or 6 hours of Skype interviews back before Zoom was the thing. What happened to Skype?
It's still alive.
Does anybody use it anymore?
I had to use it a couple weeks ago, but like I had to reset my password because I hadn't used it in so many years.
Yeah, I haven't used it forever. I liked Skype. But anyway, I got the job, and it was great because we bought a house before either of us had jobs, so that was kind of scary because prior to that I was squatting and never owned a house, so it was a big step. But yeah, quickly the program, they kind of hired me. Their community meal or soup kitchen, call it what you like, has been around for 32 years in town, so it's pretty exciting. But they wanted to have someone organize around hunger. So why are people there? Why are people coming hungry? Why are they constantly coming year after year? So I created a program, and there's a 3-pronged approach where one, we ask why people are hungry in the wealthiest country in the world, which, you know, any given day in the United States, 43.3 million people experience hunger insecurity, which is different than in Africa, and this is kind of intense, trigger warning, but 10,000 kids will starve to death today in Africa. So there's a difference between starvation and food insecurity, but that's our country. And then currently we have anywhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people experiencing homelessness in our country. So we ask why. Some of our answers: systemic racism, unjust economic systems, lack of feminist analysis, homophobia. So that's the first. We ask why before. And then our second approach is to meet the immediate needs of hunger and housing in Asbury Park. And we do that through our pantry and soup kitchen. We do about 40,000 meals a year in the community. And then we also directly get people housing. We help them navigate social services. We're basically social workers. And then the third part is to organize within the community to end future injustice and hunger and housing. And so we created multiple organizations. Some are Trinity-based, and then some are within the city. So for instance, at Trinity, there's the Racial Justice Project. But then we started the Asbury Park Affordable Housing Coalition that was housed in Trinity, and we met at Trinity because it's a free space to meet. Because unfortunately, really in Asbury, the free spaces to meet are mostly churches. So, but we also wanted to look at, well, why are people hungry? It's because rent's so expensive. There's not affordable housing. So we meet the immediate needs of hunger, but then we also kind of want to organize to figure out what the roots of those injustices are.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that like, you know, it's not unpopular for people to talk about how exclusionary churches and religions are. Yet at the same time, some of the most inclusive spaces that you can find, as you just detailed, that's a free space you can meet.
Yeah.
I remember when I was coming up as a musician in like hardcore music and punk rock music, half of the shows were in the basements of churches.
Yeah.
So there's something funny there. But you mentioned identifying 3 problems and starting off with the question of why is this happening? What's the most common refrain that you've heard since you've been asking the question of why?
Well, you know, I think why is like what I hear from the community. You know, people they don't necessarily use the word systemic racism, colonialism. You know, those are some things we've kind of deemed, and I can talk about that. But what I hear is there's not a lot of housing in Asbury. If they want to live in Asbury, it's too expensive. They have a hard time getting a job in Asbury that would be able to actually pay for rent in Asbury, which I think you'll find some of your favorite baristas or bartenders don't live in Asbury because it's pretty expensive. Yeah, and I mean, those are kind of the main things, and just really navigating the system. And some people's stories is, they lost their job and just couldn't find a new one and couldn't pay rent, and then they got evicted, and then they got depressed, started using alcohol or opiates, and then, went this way. And then some people, I think there's sometimes a stigma that people have a certain use disorders, but some people have serious mental health issues, and I think that is like one of the real roots. And what you see in Asbury, I think, is really interesting. I think when Reagan sort of shut down the mental health institutions and started placing them in prison rather than a health institution, all the institutions closed, and specifically Asbury got a lot of the folks who had certain mental health issues, and so now you see those people are still here from the 70s. They haven't gotten the right care, and
well, that's absolutely right. Not just Asbury Park, but Ocean Grove as well.
At Ocean Grove as well.
When I was younger, and I also delivered mail for a short period in Ocean Grove. I was like a part-timer.
Oh, I like that. I could picture your like tote bag, and you're like.
That's right. I was what they call a casual carrier.
Ooh.
And I had the tote. I actually had a cart, which I had to fight off a dog once. We can get into that later. But many of the hotels, I forget which street it's along. It's actually along right in front of the gigantic cross church in Ocean Grove, the great auditorium. A lot of those hotels were where those folks went. And I remember I would often, in the regular mail, I'd be delivering meds. And they're like, okay, so you're just going to walk in, and it's going to, it's going to be an interesting scene. There may or may not be a nurse. You just put the package in the foyer, and that's how we do that.
Yeah.
And I always remember Ocean Grove being, the kind of place where, on this side of the street there were skateboard punks, and on the other side of the street there were some folks who clearly needed support and mental health services.
Yeah.
And it's not quite the Ocean Grove that it looks like right now.
Yeah.
So I remember those times.
There's
and
still a decent amount of boarding houses in Ocean Grove.
No doubt.
Still.
I guess I'm just not hanging out skateboarding as much, so I'm not seeing the day-to-day quite as much.
No, I mean, it's definitely not quite as much as before, but there's still a decent amount for like what the Victorian beauty that Ocean Grove is today.
It's amazing. And they talked about the closure of, I guess they were state funded or nationally funded, I'm not really sure how all that works, in Marlborough and other places in these hospitals, and that's where the folks went, and they were generally on their own, and it was a rough scene.
Yeah, I like to think of like One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, which is one of my dad's favorite movies. But just imagine they're like, all right, guys, you're good, like, bye. Like,
I was the Nurse Ratched. I was like, medication. Here's a box. I don't know what's in it, but clearly there's a bunch of people storming the foyer right now, so I'm just going to put it down and go on my way. It was the first time that I'd really noticed firsthand, and I guess was a part of, in some respect, being those injustices, the difference between what I thought was going on and what was actually going on. That was the first time I felt it firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this might be off topic, but, I think about, veterans that are, out in the world, and they get back and they don't get mental health services. And currently, I think this is like maybe a year or two statistic, that 15 to 16, and this is also intense, 15 to 16,000 vets take their own lives after, like, there's more casualties than in the Afghan war. And just 2 years, that's like the amount of folks that lost their life in the Vietnam War. And like vets who fight for the country still aren't even getting the mental health care. They say it would be like, I'm just making up numbers, but they couldn't afford the mental health care that it would cost if people actually got what they want. And it was really fun, actually. I went to go to this event in New York City, And there was this old Spanish anarchist that fought in the Spanish Civil War against Franco and the fascists. He was like 90. He barely could walk. And he was just telling these stories. And he's like, I'm very concerned for the vets today. He was such a sweetie. You know, he wasn't like, he was anti-war. But he wasn't like making people feel bad. He wasn't like talking shits on vets and stuff. But he's like, I'm very scared for you because, you know, when I was fighting war, you know, you threw a bomb over and you look over and you're like, we killed a bunch of fascists. But now you like throw, and it's the family, you know, it's just the lines aren't quite as clear. And he, you know, and then I think when we see that, people are coming back and there's not the mental health services. And that's actually what got me politicized. When I was 18, I traveled the country for a while, volunteering in different soup kitchens. And I just heard people's stories. I just never really met that many people experiencing homelessness before I was 18.
A lot of vets?
That's what politicized me. I'd say, I forget the statistic, it's a third or a quarter of all people experiencing homelessness are vets. And when I was 18, I wasn't quite as left as I am now. I didn't have this like anti-war, anti-imperialist analysis. But I was just like, wait a minute. Like, you fought for the country and like you don't have a house? Like I just like couldn't, it like blew me away. It just didn't make sense to me. And that is really kind of how I am here today. People experiencing homelessness were the people that educated me to those injustices. And I just couldn't, you know, other than like listening to punk and Rage Against the Machine growing up, you know, my analysis was like, you know, not quite there. But that was like, it just didn't make sense. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, you're willing to give your life for your country and you don't have housing at that rate. Because we were just constantly meeting people. They're like, I was in this war, I was in this war, I was in this war, telling us these insane stories.
Oh, the stories are nuts. I remember when I first started teaching, I taught for a bit in charter schools. And I remember the history teacher at the time, he was a veteran, and he clearly was struggling with what, at least on paper, as I understood it, heavy PTSD. And every now and then, he would open up for a second, and it was the most horrible stories. He's like, yeah, so, you know, most of the time I was just in Somalia. I guess this was during Operation Iraqi Freedom. I don't know what the tagline was or what the slogan was. He's like, yeah, most of the time we're in Somalia, just driving around in a tank, picking up body parts and getting pot shotted at
just
from
like
just hills and
story.
Sand dunes. And by the way, those were just kids, like bored locals, just, hey, let's just shoot at the U.S. tanks. Or maybe they were shooting at any tank. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so just getting shot at all day and picking up body parts. And then I said, okay, well, I could see, and this is just a normal guy up until that point, I assume, Brooklyn Italian guy, loud, liked food, you know, the Yankees, typical, like exactly what you'd imagine. And then when I started to hear those stories, and he just really struggled, and I think about him a lot, and he's bounced around the country every now and then. I'll reach out, and he's in like a different location, and I don't know if that relates to his inability to maybe secure housing, but certainly his inability to secure himself.
Yeah. And, you know, obviously wars are real, but do you ever, you know, I remember after I got out of high school actually hearing people tell the story. I was like, oh yeah, like it's actually real. People run at each other with guns. Like, I mean, this is wild to actually picture. I've never been in that place. I work with the Kurds in northern Syria right now. And just they're fighting ISIS. And they're fighting Turkey. I mean, this is their reality. And, you know, we're like, how was your day? I'm like, like my kid, like, he had a fit and I had to get him to the car. It was a rough spot, you know? But then the other people's stories are this. I'm like, whew. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think mental health is a huge issue with, you know, people experiencing homelessness or having trouble with housing or, you know, not, you know, knowing where their next meal is coming with. I think they're all, we use the term intersectionality. So all the different oppressions are kind of coming together to cause hunger or housing or racial injustice.
So how does it happen? I hear this line all the time, the wealthiest nation on earth. I have a tough time with that phrase because I feel like it's true, but it's not the people's wealth. We're not talking about the wealth of the people. We're talking about the wealth of a few people and the government and investors, and the governments that we partner with. And a lot of that money is never seen on the street, is never seen by families or by people. So I do have a tough time with that term sometimes. But still, how come trickle-down economics doesn't work? How come that doesn't work?
Yeah, I don't think it was ever meant to work. You know, I think Dorothy Day, who's this radical Catholic woman that started the Catholic worker movement, said all the problems stem from our acceptance of this dirty, filthy, rotten system, which capitalism, U.S. imperialism. And, you know, I think the other person said something like, they're like, the country's not working. And they're like, it's working exactly the way it was designed to work. It's working great. You know, if you read like James Madison, he says some wild stuff in the original writings. He's like, we can never let these peasants make decisions. They'll ruin democracy. It has to be like the ruling class of the landowners that are making decisions. And, you know, it hasn't really changed that much. I mean, slavery is no longer here, which is huge and good. But, you know, slavery is still able to exist in the 13th Amendment in prison systems. Slavery literally was never abolished, and it exists within the prison system. And, you know, when I saw the people, like, going through the Capitol, I'm like, you're literally taking over the Capitol because you feel like an election was stolen when it wasn't. But I thought, what if people stormed the Capitol to be like, let's end slavery in prisons? That seems like a pretty good thing to be like, what are you all doing in this building if slavery still exists in 2021? You know? So, yeah.
So how... I mean, I do believe, you know, the average person is thinking about and focusing energy on what they say, a more perfect union. And I definitely think the country has improved over time. So I want to be clear about that. However, you know, getting to a more perfect union, I mean, there's no end to that. I don't think there'll ever be a time when it's like, all right, got that under wraps. But what are some small local steps? You work locally, so we're talking big. What are some small things that people need or people can do locally to chip away at getting to this more perfect, or just better? Let's call it better, better place.
Well, you know, and you know, it's sometimes if you come to the soup kitchen, not so much during COVID, but before, we'd have 12 or 13 volunteers, and we get the meal, the salads, the fresh food, whatever, ready. And there's normally about 30 minutes before, and we'll do a food justice talk. Why are people hungry? And we kind of have this conversation. And I like to give kind of some simple things so that people don't like leave being like, oh my gosh, everything is so fucked. Like, what do we do? You know? But I like to do both, you know, like some simple things, and then, you know, let's get some hard things, you know?
No doubt.
But yeah, I mean, I think really you were talking about it earlier, and it sounds corny, but just talking to people. I see so many people just walk by people. They're like, hey, and I know they're asking for money, and but really just listening to someone's story and making them feel human is like huge. I mean, that could stop them from like taking that bundle of dope today, or, you know, just one kindness, because life just feels like against you. So it's just super simple when you see someone and maybe you don't want to give them money, but if you have the money, buy them some food and just chat with them. Hey, how are you doing? What's going on?
My buddy taught me that move. He said, look, if you're uncomfortable handing money to someone when you're on your way into the store, grab a bagel, grab a sandwich, grab a can of something that doesn't require a can opener to open, and bring that out. And I thought it was silly at the time, and like that's been my move now for like some years. Or I always keep like a snack in the car sometimes. You just like hand someone a snack.
And it kind of starts there, right? And we had this project in New York City where a guy gave us his bill. We were squatting his building But then we met him and we told him this vision of squatting a building. And this was actually in Bushwick, right by the Bedford Ave stop, maybe like 10 years ago. And we had this vision of inviting our friends who were living on the streets to live with us, because what we started out doing years before we were inviting people to live with us in the squat was we were just handing food and socks out to people. And what we would do is we would just talk to them and really get to know their story. And then when it was winter, we're like, oh, holy shit, like Larry is just like out on the street, you know, and it was your friend was out on the street. And so it wasn't this like radical anarchist thing to do. It was just like, oh man, like we should provide a warm space for these folks, you know. And I think that's where it can lead to, you know, build some relationships with people on the corners, really get to know them, and then yeah, sometimes you might be able to help them out, help find a job, help find housing, and then this is how things really change. And it's really interesting. About 4 years ago, we started the Women's Hospitality Network, which is a network in Asbury that's a multiracial church network that houses women December, January, February, and March, and then tries to transition them while they're staying at the churches. We find them permanent housing. But each night they go to a different church. And what's really cool about this network, one, is there's white and black churches participating. There's like queer and gay churches participating with black churches that are maybe not the most affirming, but just coming together for this common cause. And the event that started it, I had 8 people who were experiencing homelessness. And real quick, the reason I always say experiencing homelessness, it's kind of a mouthful, is, I mean, I think people know you don't call people a bum. Like, it's not nice. But the reason I say that that's something that person's experiencing, like, they're not homeless. It's not like who they are. You know, that's just what's going on in their life.
And plus that term has a sense of permanency to it, doesn't it? So when you say experiencing, that has more of a temporary feel.
Yeah, it's just like a moment. It's something that's happening. Some people identify as homeowner. Like, I have a home, and maybe if someone's like, are you a homeowner? I'll be like, yeah. But I don't like self-identify as a homeowner, you know? I'm like,
yeah, got a house.
But anyway, so we had this event where we just had 8 people experiencing homelessness. They were the main speakers. And the flyer was like, you're not hearing from a social worker. You're not hearing any textbook. You're just hearing from our community what it's like to live on the streets in Asbury. And we had about 100 people come. And just, I could barely picture events before COVID.
Dude.
I'm like, we had 100 people? And like I think at punk shows, I'm like, will we ever get to scream into a microphone in the front of a stage? I'm like, I can't picture it. But anyway, about 100 people came, and the 8 folks spoke. And it was so powerful. And some of them were not sober. And I was like, oh, this is going to be a shitstorm. And it was beautiful. And it was so powerful. 3 people asked me afterwards. They asked me people's story, and they took them home that night. You know, so I mean, you could go from just buying someone a sandwich and saying hi and getting to know their story to like maybe helping with jobs and housing. You know, there's this way to go.
Communication it's everything.
It's huge, because we also, like, you might not be a social worker, but you know how to like pick up a phone and talk to someone and figure out what you got to do. And I mean, during COVID, you know, our social workers were kind of the only folks open. So anyone who didn't have a phone came to us. And this was scary when COVID first came. I was like 8 feet from people. I'd put my speakerphone and be like, keep your mask on. You could use my phone. They would make the calls that they need to make because there was nowhere to make them.
Yeah.
I mean, just the most simple things. Let someone use your phone. But then also, yeah, I mean, donate to local charities. If you're a landlord and you have lots of buildings, maybe make some of them affordable. You know, have some at market rate, have some under market rate. You know, like share your wealth. I think, you know, one of the issues I think you were talking about, the wealth disparity in the country. I think 8 people in the world control half the person's wealth, or half the world's wealth. So it's like 8 people have as much money as 3.5 billion people, and 6 of them live in the United States. And, you know, so it's not capitalism, it's not communism. It's just, I think it's just got to be this, we got to start sharing more. We got to start figuring out ways to house people. But yeah,
people have been doing that locally forever. Yeah. Small groups have existed forever. Churches have historically done good work there, despite some of the not so great things that have sprouted from organized religion.
Yeah.
So how does political change occur?
Yeah, I mean, so in Asbury, I mean, it's really interesting. I think every city political change occurs differently, but I think it's also about relationships. If we're going to talk about Asbury, it's a small town, you know, whatever. I mean, people say what they will about our city council. If you email or call them, like, they will get back to you, and you could sit down with them and they'll talk to you no matter what side you're on. And that's different. You know, if you live in New York or Philly, yeah, good luck trying to talk to the mayor.
There's some good people on the council,
you know,
for sure.
And so I think it's about building relationship first, building trust. Because whatever, there's a lot of like left activists that, you know, might want to be like careerist, or there's an ulterior motive. But, you know, once you build relationships and get to know people, and you have this needs to change. And, you know, I could talk about the Affordable Housing Coalition. It was a really huge victory in the beginning of Corona. In March, the city passed 8 inclusionary zoning ordinances, which basically means that there's 8 different areas within the whole city that if a building with 5 or more units is built, it's mandatory that there's 20% mixed affordable housing. So we started this group like 3 or 4 years ago with realizing people are hungry because there's not enough affordable housing. So we were trying to really get the root of the problem. And only two of us started it, and now we're about 15 or 20. And then we started working with Fair Share Housing, who is the larger sort of social justice housing organization in all of New Jersey. And we helped draft these 8 ordinances, and we worked with the city back and forth. And, you know, they eventually passed, and this makes us pretty much have the most progressive affordable housing in the coast of New Jersey, minus like Atlantic City. So it's a huge victory, very excited, and 2 people started it with an idea, and you know, you got to keep going. It doesn't pay. It's exhausting. But yeah, so I think it's really important to have that personal change, to really like talk to people, get to know people, but then also be pushing politically at the same time. So to do both, we call it a diversity of tactics.
Well, there's no shortcuts to meaningful change. I mean, these days, it's very easy to yell and scream and share a post like that's really putting yourself out there, folks. You know, whatever. But those are benign things. I think that says more about a person trying to posture, and appear to be down with something. But there's certainly no change can occur from that. Everything is grassroots. Everything is changing yourself, having conversations, and then grinding.
Yeah.
So first of all, congratulations being one of the 2 people you're referring to get that going. But I have a specific question about that. And maybe I could assume I know what 20% affordable housing means, but is that simply a percentage of rent lower? Meaning, hey, every room in this building is going to be $1,000, but the 20% are going to be $460. Does it come down to just a simple equation? How does it work?
Kind of. It's a little more complicated. So I think that the issue with housing, that HBO show, what was it called? Like Show Me a Hero? Did you ever see it? It's a 6-episode HBO series. It's phenomenal, on the struggle for affordable housing in Yonkers. It's amazing. It's a Shakespeare quote. I think it's "Show me a hero and I'll show you a tragedy," but the show is just "Show me a hero." But it kind of goes over the story of how it, you know, happened, and is really beautiful. But what they came up with is that affordable housing should never just be in one area. In Asbury Park, the southwest side. You know, if you just have a bunch of folks that are low income, they're not able to have jobs, also happen to like not have the same education as other people in the town, there's going to be something happening. So with the 20% mixed affordable, it's everywhere throughout the city. And so, for instance, if there's a building with 5 units, 20% would be 1 unit, and it would be affordable. And mixed means low to moderate low income. And they'd have to kind of share that with all the affordable housing that they create. They have to like kind of stagger it. So there'd be like moderately low income, and then there'd be very low income.
So you qualify, excuse me, based on your income.
Correct.
And then is the rent identified based on your income, or is that already predetermined?
Yeah, based on your income. And it depends. And again, it depends if that is like taking Section 8 or, that's just public housing and this is a private building that you need to do 20% affordable. If it's just a private building, that would be dictated on, like, say there's 20 units, 20% of that is...
Dude, don't look at me for a minute.
Well, we'll just
don't do it.
We'll go there. And so there would have to be one for like low, which they would kind of establish what that percentage is. But in Monmouth County, medium income is $90,000. So if you make $90,000 or under, you're like low income.
Well, yeah, it's relative. I mean, historically, Monmouth County's been one of the wealthiest counties in the nation.
Yeah. So it's a hard town because, currently Asbury, I would say that about statistically, I think 32 to 34% of the people are under the poverty line that live in our town. And I would argue, just from the work I do, that another 20% are either there or close to. So it's a pretty wild concept that about 50% of our cities either under the poverty line or close to. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think politically we could do it. I think, we talk about the church, and it's really interesting. The rescue mission is a great place in town. It really gives a place for men experiencing homelessness to go. But they also do force religion. If you want to stay there, you have to hear a sermon.
Well, we had Dan Gilio on this podcast.
There you go.
And he got into that a bit.
Yeah.
And he was, he was aware that, for some people there might be a conflict within themselves, say a gentleman going there. He got into that a little bit. I mean, he came out on what I think is an appropriate side of it, and I think anyone who's doing work to help people, do you.
Yeah.
Certainly. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to let you know we spoke
that's
with
cool. And they do great work. And, but it's also just complicated. Like, people are, needing a place to stay. They're going to tell you anything you want to hear, and so then there's these unsincere changes that are happening because people constantly are taught how to kind of get through the system, right? I can get housing at this place if I do this Jesus discipleship for, and you're doing it for that reason. I mean, I identify as Judeo-Christian, so I get the faith part, but if you're doing it for reasons that aren't sincere, it's probably not the best thing. But that could be about anything.
That can go for anything.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is name a left shelter, that the liberal have just funded on their own money. Most shelters, rescue missions around the country are actually kind of from more right-wing theological perspectives that they're set up. So what would it look like if folks in Asbury, we try to figure out housing. We really try to figure out jobs. How do we hire folks? Multiple people doing multiple different things. And that happens, but just kind of asking your question. If we each took a bunch of people, right? And then, or it started more cooperatives that are worker owned so that there was more, power for workers to gain equity and all these different things,
So how does it happen then that the people who put the most lawn signs out and wear the most stuff speaking these slogans historically tend to do the least when it comes to work on the ground? If I had to divide up the people that I've met over my life, definitely the super right-leaning ones are the ones making food at the food kitchens, housing people that they don't know. They were the most right. The people on the left, again, I'm making huge generalities here. I don't even like these terms, but for purposes of this conversation, friends of mine or people I've known who are all about the slogan, got all the appropriate lawn signage. It's all in place. Maybe they're sending in a check to one or two places, but I physically doing the least. I always thought that was an interesting, which is also one of the reasons I don't like to use these terms, because I think they get muddled up and I think it's bullshit in the end. People are people. Good people do good things. Most people do nothing, and some people do things that are harmful.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting. I always like to think of, I did a lot of hitchhiking. I'd say out of hundreds of rides, maybe 5 or 10 liberals picked me up. Everyone else, like, racist, homophobic.
Yeah.
Nicest person to me, like, which I understand. I have this, like, I'm a white person, so they were great to me.
We also talked about your voice has a specific vibe.
Yes. Yes, it does. And what I will tell you, we talked about my voice sounding like a happy stoner.
Happy stoner.
Which is true. But it's also so interesting with these truck drivers, because my thing was like, I will never like agree to racism with a truck driver. I will be like bob my head to like the N word. I'll be like, oh yeah, like I don't really use that word, like kindly, like I say it like nicely, but I was like, I'm not gonna like just to get a ride, like not say.
Who's gonna argue with a truck driver when you're sitting shotgun? Like you're in the most like.
Well, this is the thing.
You're not in a position of power.
But truck drivers like to argue, you know. So I would say that I was like, oh, I don't really use that word, and we would talk about why, you know. But I have had 5 or 6 truck drivers like come out to me, like as someone who's not straight, and like I've never told anyone this. You just seem like a really nice like person, and I mean they also did proposition me at the same time.
Well, you're a handsome guy. Let's be honest. Let's be honest, Derek.
I was like, oh, this is a podcast. No one can see me, but that's not true.
So all you truck drivers out there watching this on Route 42, whatever.
Yeah, there we go. I'm available. But it was also just like really, and this is what actually confuses, because most of my family is Trump supporters. My dad grew up in South Central Pennsylvania. Great people. You know, they'd stand in front of a bus for me, literally. Raised me, super sweet, got each other's back, like work together, like have parties with their work colleagues, you know. Yes, it's very complicated just to what, you know, what's going on in our country, you know. And I think there's a lot of hatred motivated by it. And I'm kind of like, how do I bring my family back? You know, I love my family. How do we like talk about, you know, we'll get in arguments. I'm like, Trump, Joe Biden, like they really don't understand us, you know, like let's talk about like what our rights are and what we really want to do, you know. We've just gotten in these boxes of like,
well, people, that's the thing. Unfortunately, people have taken themselves and projected themselves onto these stages of left, right, politician, but that's not real life.
Yeah, I mean, also one of one of the main members of the Affordable Housing Coalition, you know, is more right. Is like a capitalist. Him and I just argue all the time. He's a capitalist. I'm like, dude, you're talking socialism. He's like, no, it's conscious capitalism. And I'm like, we go back and forth. But I mean, we work really well together.
Well, that's why it's important to, as you said, communicate, which is the foundation of any relationship, clearly. Be it one-on-one or be it a country and its leaders, but you said it. You have to communicate, because things get muddled if you're not speaking, and especially when people want to use these big words. Oh, that's socialism. Oh, that's conscious. I forget what conscious capitalism or what. Like, but if you talk about, like you said, your rights and ideas, you don't have to apply any of those terms. You can just talk about policy, basically, which will work itself out. You don't have to apply a term to it a lot of times. And it also allows you to avoid a lot of yelling and screaming with people in your family, as I know just as well as you.
Well, there's a story. I realized that you had a member from Bad Religion speak last week, so I'm going to go in the opposite direction and tell a quick Bible story. Is that getting too wild?
His aura had just left yesterday, so you're good.
Yeah, I mean, amazing human being he is. So anyway, in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 2, there's this really interesting thing that happens. You know, Jesus is gone. You know, whether you believe this is literal or a fake story, it still has the same meaning. And the apostles are talking to people and spreading the word. And so this is the first sighting of the Holy Spirit. And there's about 3,000 to 5,000 people listening to people speak, the apostles speak. And they believe in God, the Holy Spirit comes, they're speaking in tongues, and that's always taught as the miracle. But often in churches, the next thing that happened doesn't get taught as a miracle. And it's really amazing. And out of that 3,000 or 5,000 people, it says that the people at the top saw that people at the bottom didn't have things. They just like realized it. And so it says they all sold what they had so that they could live in common. And it was all about love, right? Because capitalism is survival of the fittest, whoever works harder, pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And then communism is like, this is the right thing to do. The state's going to force or kill you to do it, right? But here's just this story where people are just like, oh my gosh, like my neighbor doesn't have what I have. Like, what if that happened? Or what if the church did that even, I like to kind of think of those. That's a pretty small thing. What if everyone just started sharing their money? Because, it's funny. You go into, like, kindergarten, right? Can you imagine going to a kindergarten? There's, like, I don't know, like 5 black kids, 5 Latinx Hispanic kids, and, like, 4 white kids, right? And then, like, 2 white kids take all the toys, and they're like, well, they got there first. I guess you all are just, you got to deal with it, right? Like, they're like, no, like, you gotta share. But then all of a sudden, at some point, they're like, nah, fuck sharing. Like, get your money, like, get your house. Like, it's just this weird concept that, like, sometimes happens.
Thank God there's a teacher in the room. Because, as you know, some playrooms do devolve. Well, actually, it's not even devolving. I think it's quite primal. For children. I mean, it comes down to personality type, too. But if you got some tough guy in there,
yeah,
he's gonna have the toys.
Yeah. So yeah, what would a society look like? Because I don't really love capitalism or communism. I think they've kind of failed in some ways. So what would it look like where we just kind of agree? We live in Asbury Park. 50% of the folks are in the poverty line. Like, let's do stuff with the city. Let's do stuff with our churches. Let's do stuff with music. And then maybe, yeah, we just like do stuff with our housing and our money. Yeah, like what would it look like if we all just were like, let's do something?
I think we've already got some things that
absolutely
speak to that. Again, I don't like using these big terms, socialism, all that, but we have socialistic policies in this country, ever since FDR, and maybe even before there were some beginnings of that. My grandfather, he was a recipient, a survivor of during the New Deal, being able to join the CC camps, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yeah.
By the way, there was no resources. It was like, get to California and work on this dam. He's like, yeah, but I'm in Hoboken. They're like, just get there. So he was like a professional hitchhiker for a while. He had all these great stories when he was alive. Missed that guy. Gosh. Shout out to Lou. I think early childhood education nationally, I think would be one of the strongest starts. Amazingly, that doesn't really come up in too many debates on a national level. And of course, healthcare.
Yeah.
Expanding that, if you could take care of people right at the beginning, and maybe not right at the end, but when you're having struggles with your health and all that, which regardless of your wealth or anything, it hits you. I mean, cancer, being one of those things that you don't know. You have no idea. It's your genetics, it's your environment, and then it's the X factor.
I literally have this like mark. Not that you can see it. And I'm like, what is that? I should get. I'm like, but I gotta go to I gotta go to the doctor. And like my insurance lapsed. And it's like been like 6 months, and I've had this thing, and I just.
Has it changed shape or color?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't gotten like bigger.
My mother worked for a dermatologist for years, so she is like the high priestess of skincare.
Oh.
So if you want me to take a picture and send it to Maria Scotto, Independent Services, she's retired now, but she knows she knows about the dermal layers quite well.
I'm going to take you up on that.
Yeah, seriously. But the one thing to look out for, changing shape, changing color, and is it raised?
Yes, it is not. I mean, I went online and kind of like searched it. I was like, all right.
You got this.
But yeah, and I think that's why I like the diversity of tactics. Like, go with government. Like, go for big change, right? Like, but, I really appreciated the Black Panthers in the 70s. And one of my friends, Aaron Dixon, was the Black Panther who started the Seattle chapter. We met out in Albuquerque just doing work. And yeah, he just set up a free health clinic. It was like, people in low-income Black communities aren't getting the help they need. And it's still there today.
In Albuquerque?
And it's actually in Seattle.
Oh.
But I met him in Albuquerque. Yeah, confusing story. So, there's pictures of him on like the Capitol building, in Seattle, in like Olympia, maybe, I don't even know where it is, armed with like a shotgun, a black man armed with a shotgun with his like Black Panther, but he was like starting reading programs for kids, which actually the reading programs are like designed off breakfast programs for kids. And, so I think we need all these different things. Like, okay, the VNA does great work in Asbury. Great work.
What is the VNA?
Geez, you're going to make me say the acronym.
Or generally speaking.
Yeah. Oh, that's really bad. I mean, the VNA is just a health center within Asbury Park that does things for the whole community.
Clinic,
it's a clinic for low income, for middle. I actually go and see a doctor there for middle income people. They do a lot of work with HIV and AIDS work and with the LGBTQIA plus community. Great resource, but wouldn't hurt if, Trinity had like a place where you could do like a needle exchange or, get your blood pressure checked or, whatever, having more, because I think, the right will be like, well, where's all this money going to come from? It's like, maybe we don't need that. Maybe doctors just volunteer here or there to like, you get a whole bunch of doctors to volunteer and it doesn't cost money. I think we have to come up with creative ways to, one of my favorite books is by this group called Insight Women of Color Against Violence. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it's like, sometimes you're just going to have to do work where you're not getting paid if we really want our society to kind of like flip over.
Well, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the Genesis story, just to stick with the biblical references.
I thought we were going to the band because truck drivers love some Genesis, let me tell you. I've like listened to their whole discography in a truck.
Dude, I have a huge man crush, art crush, vocal crush on Phil Collins.
Oh yeah.
So.
Oh man.
So I don't want to disparage anything that Phil Collins has ever been a part of. He's like one of my heroes.
He's like, what's funny, I didn't really like whatever. I didn't have anything bad to say about Genesis, but this truck driver Calvin, who I'm still in touch with, we drove like across North Dakota and Montana together on solstice. It's a beautiful night. We're in this truck, and he's just so in. He's like CD by CD giving me the discography. He's like, oh, I got to tell you about this album and this breakup. I'm like, I have like such a heart for Genesis now, and like I'll never forget that. And I swear the sun set up in North. It was like 11:30 at night when the sun set. It was a very beautiful moment. So like Genesis has a deep place in my heart, both the Bible book and the band.
Now that we got that straight.
Yeah.
So your Genesis story, it seems like, is what you just described was, having to do things with little resources. So you've mentioned hitchhiking and squatting more than once in this conversation. I have a very mixed knowledge and mixed experience with squatting. What the hell is squatting? And is it legal?
Yeah, no. So it's actually, technically squatting is not even a thing. It's like adverse possession is like the legal term. Like squatting doesn't exist. So for instance, in New York, technically, if you can prove that you've been in a building and fixing it and improving it for 10 years, that the city will have to give you that. It's adverse possession. So I just met this amazing graphic novel. It's called War in the Neighborhood by Seth Tabachchin. It's bad. But it's about the history of the riots in Tompkins Square Park in New York City and all the squats that existed, because the Tompkins Square Park used to be called Tent City. It's about people experiencing homelessness and how they were pushed out during gentrification. But yeah, the history of squats, at least in the United States, was mostly like migrants coming off the boats. Irish, Italian migrants just didn't have anywhere to go, and they saw an abandoned building, and they went in it, and then they fixed it up, and eventually someone came and they either started paying rent for it, or they ended up using adverse possession and taking over the building. So when I was in New York squatting, it was like 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. It was just different. Like any building we were squatting, we weren't gonna get, anymore. I think there was 3 squats left over on the Lower East Side that they actually did. They won the battle, and the city gave them these buildings, and I think they just like pay taxes on it. So it's
who owns these buildings typically, or are they? I'm
so
fascinated by this.
So they create like a board, I think, and then the board owns it. Who like the board of squatters, the people that literally just squat in a building, they just go in a building and stay squatting, and then the city gave them these buildings because they were able to prove that they lived there, and they improved it over a certain amount of years. And if you read this graphic novel, War of the Neighborhoods, I mean, there was like massive conflicts. I mean, the NYPD drove tanks to get these squatters out of the buildings in like 70s and 80s. Tanks, like literally tanks would pull out.
It probably looked just as ridiculous as horse-drawn carriages in New York City.
No, yeah, I mean, it was pretty wild. And this is in the 70s and 80s that this was happening. But yeah, and I think I was 20. I'm not going to be able to get $1 million or $2 million building in New York City to start housing folks from the streets. And maybe I could have, but that was not my skill set. But I just noticed, I was like, hey, there's these buildings. No one's in them. And why don't we... we were trying to get a building, but no one was going to give us a building. And so we just... You break into them illegally. I'm saying this on camera. Not that I've ever done that.
No, someone else.
That's what I hear people do. And then sometimes the one squat that we did get permission of the... owner, so it's still illegal. It was, we were warehousing, which you're not allowed to live in a warehouse. It's zoned for a warehouse. But the owner gave us permission to live there, and we built bathrooms and kitchens, and we had like 15 people. It was basically like a squat shelter.
So you were holding up the spirit of it in that you're there, but you're improving it. You were improving. I mean, is that common?
And actually, it's really funny. The cops, the NYPD came in one day, and they're like, hey, can we come in? And, and technically they need a warrant. But I'm also like, would they get, you got to like, are they going to get the warrant and then come in? Because we're illegally living here. And we have, we had like bed sheets covering the windows at night, so they couldn't tell anyone was in there at night. So anyway, I decided to let the police in. I was like, they're like, we hear people have been stealing bikes, and you have a bunch of bikes here. And they looked at our bikes, and they were a bunch of pieces of shit. So they're like, oh, these are, they're like hipster bikes were being taken, like fixed gear, $1,200 bikes. And they're like, these are not the bikes that are being reported. And they started walking around, and literally we just had like beds. Like we made them by two by fours, and it was fucking cold. It was the middle of the winter, and we couldn't keep warm. So we put a tent in the middle of the building where we like knocked some holes in the wall and used propane to heat this tent. So the tent would be like 80 degrees, but then when you leave the tent, it was like 20 degrees in the squat. And the cops saw them, like, oh, you're just like fixing up. They're like, you're going to make a killing. We're like, yeah. And then they just like left. And it was kind of a miracle that nothing happened.
So how does a guy like you, so I think a lot of people maybe on first glance at this idea of squatting would feel that that's someone taking advantage of a situation. That's someone who's not contributing. That's someone who's basically stealing what someone else worked very hard to get. However, I realize it's more nuanced than that. And in fact, when one of the tours I did over in Europe, one or two of the places that we stayed at, I believe, were just squat buildings.
Were you in Amsterdam or London?
I've been in all those places. At the time, this was in Germany.
Oh yeah.
Where I was never asking any questions. I just followed the toughest, drunkest guy to not upset him. It's almost like the truck driver thing. I'm just like, yep, I'm with that guy who's just itching to fight someone, so I'm just going to follow him and agree with him. And but surely you can understand how society at large would kind of look at that and be like, so how does a guy who kind of comes from that or experienced that in many ways go on to sort of do the things you're doing right now? What's the transformation from squatting, which seems like all of your energies are going into self-survival. Like, it doesn't seem like if you're squatting, you have a lot of time to be setting up a soup kitchen or to be thinking about affordable housing or to be having those conversations with the homeless. It seems like you're sort of you're not far from that yourself, and you're self-sustaining. So how does it transition? How does it pivot for you personally? What happened?
Well, also just real quick, in Philly, just during COVID, this squatting group just got the city to give them 70 buildings. It was one of like the largest land redistribution. It was like 5 people experiencing homelessness and like 2 organizers with them. I'm forgetting the name of the organization, but it was just some of the most amazing things I've heard, because they just started, people were getting evicted during COVID and they had nowhere to go. And so these squatters would break in families, which this is more traditional like squatting from like early settlers coming to the United States. And so the police just weren't coming, they're not going to break families out. And so literally, I think like 12 of the buildings they got were buildings they were being squatted, and they won them.
Wow.
You know, I think because there's this, you know, speaking of like punk rock, you know, there's a Bakunin quote who's like kind of a father of like punk rock or anarchism, but not Bakunin, it was Proudhon, the French philosopher, but he says property is theft. And when you really look at that, he wasn't meaning like don't own your wallet or don't own your house, but what he was actually talking about, property that's not in use. And that back in that day, it was like the mid 1800s, there's lots of land, that it was sort of a crime to society to own property that you weren't using or needing when there was a need in the community for housing or to plow a field and farm. And, you know, I think that's a concept I believe in. I think, you know, do people really need 2, 3, 4, 5 houses while there's 500, 600,000 people who don't have a house? So, you know, that's the question. But yeah, how do you get there? Yeah, you know, it's funny because I just did this talk with that group in Philadelphia that squatted these buildings and did this huge victory. And I was on there talking about how we did kind of this more reformed project with our the 8 inclusionary zoning ordinances that I told you about. And at one point I was like, wow, I kind of feel like a sellout. Like, you're amazing. This is the greatest thing I've ever heard. And here I am like...
Oh, your movement's too bougie now?
Yeah. I was like, oh, man, maybe I got to go back to that, you know? So, yeah, I don't... You know, there's buildings in Asbury. You know, I think I would more at this point get in touch with the owner and kind of ask, hey, like, could these people go in there? They'll fix it up for you, mow the lawn, you know, something like that. I don't know if I would break in buildings quite so much now. But yeah, I don't know. I think I do really believe, I keep saying, the diversity of tactics. I still think that's an acceptable tactic because I think housing and food should be a human right. You know, I think it's, you know, whatever, figure it out, capitalism, communism, just house people, you know, whichever you think is working. I just haven't seen it work, you know. So yeah, I believe that we need to do everything. I'm glad. I mean, there's squatters in Asbury Park. I know most of the people that live in them. You know, they happen to be like 50 and 60 and older men, but there's squatters in Asbury right now. So I do believe in that. But then I also think that the more long-term change would be, okay, now there's this law that says any new buildings have to have 20% housing. So it's like, how many more people's lives is that going to change than squatting a building? Kind of like you said, you know? And so where do you want to spend your time and what do you want to do? But I always do encourage folks that, and I know it sounds sort of hokey and maybe fits my like happy stoner voice, but it's true. You know, whatever your passion is, that you're really into, that's almost kind of what you could best do for society. Because a lot of kids are like, I want to help and I'm like, you could do it. Just get a few people and start doing it, and it, you know, it's possible.
I don't think that's hokey at all. I think it's just good old-fashioned truth.
Yeah.
I mean, but what are you going to do better other than the thing that you're passionate about?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I can try and help with some things that I have low skills in, but I'm not going to be as effective with things that I have skills in, and that's one of the reasons for this podcast. So to communicate with people and to make a voice for some folks. You're one of those folks. I appreciate you taking the time today. What can the average person, whatever that is, listening to this podcast right now, locally or nationally or globally, what can they do to support the local efforts that you're involved with today?
Yeah. Well, my email is Derek, Derek, at trinitynj.com. So Derek, Derek, at trinitynj.com. So you can email me if you're interested. We have, if you want to volunteer at the community meal, if you're a restaurant.
When is the community meal?
Community meal is every Saturday from 10:30 to 12:30. We give out to-go meals during COVID. We used to have this great, I really miss it, 200 of us would just sit in this gym and eat together. Sometimes we'd have music playing. You could come play music, if we're ever back in the gym eating. I really miss that. It was a very great community event every Saturday. But you can come volunteer there. We always need food. If you're a restaurant, you could donate a meal, 200 entrees, 200 sides. We'll make the salad and pack it in. We're always looking for restaurants because we lost a lot of our fundraisers this year because COVID.
Sure.
So that would be great. But then, if you're interested in affordable housing, get in touch with us. We have a big rent stabilization ballot initiative going on. We're also working with the city to try to see if we can agree with something before putting it to the vote. We started a transformative justice project. So we're creating an alternative for people to call instead of the police, to call social workers instead of the police for if you have mental health issues or facing domestic violence. We're starting to organize that, and we're looking for volunteers to come out with the social workers. And just a quick, beautiful story with that. Someone from, I won't use names, but a certain punk rock person from Convention Hall called, there was a gentleman who had like 6 or 7 blankets in Convention Hall, just laid out, just kind of chilling. He was listening to hip hop, and literally was like smoking a cig and a joint like at the same time in Convention Hall. And so this guy's boss is like, "Yo, you got to get this guy out of there." And he's like, "Yeah, do I have to call?" He's like, "You don't have to call the cops. Like, you just got to get this guy out of there." So he like texted the folks in the Transformative Justice Project, and I happened to be available. I was at work. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I could do this." Like, I didn't have my kid with me. So we went over, and we just talked to the guy. We did happen to like the music he was listening to. And he started packing up and kind of left. And, I did also offer, I was like, "Hey, if you're looking for housing or certain things, like we could figure that out for you." He wasn't super interested in that moment. So anyway, there's that project that's happening. There's the Racial Justice Project that, we're working on Indigenous People Day and celebrating Indigenous folks. The Lenape, who are the Sandhill Lenape tribe, is from Asbury Park specifically. And we're working on celebrating that. And then we're doing a campaign on reparations. We have the Women's Hospitality Network, which unfortunately we're housing folks in hotels. So if you have any fundraising ideas, it's very expensive to house people in hotels. So this is the network where you just house people in churches. It's basically free. We're not set up for this. But if you like to make food, if you have clothes, you want to donate, you can do that. If you want to give us a house, we're looking for a house that house people coming out of prison for the Transformative Justice Project. But if you want to come up with your own ideas of something you want to do for the community, we can provide it at Trinity and kind of support you in what you want to do. Support local organizations, and just get involved. If you have a vision, kind of push it forward. I always say I'm not a great organizer, but I'm like, we'll have an idea and I try to do it. And that's all you can do. And maybe it doesn't work, but you got to try.
Those are words to live by. Taylor, let's make sure that we get Derek's email address put in the credits at the end of the show. Shout out to Taylor, she's not through the glass, she's through the wall.
Ooh,
on the other side.
Thanks.
Who handles all of our technical duties for Through the Glass. Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks,
Let's make
Taylor.
sure we'll make sure that we get your email address there, because You mentioned about 46 different organizations.
Yes.
So I want to make sure that people can just plug in directly to you. Thanks for the work you do. Thanks for being creative. Clearly, you're a creative person, and you've got a lot of grit. And I think that those are two of the best qualities in a human being. So thanks for coming on the show today. And anything else you want to tell the people?
Just thanks for having me. Humbled to be here. And maybe I just kind of wanted to end with a question for you.
We're not allowed to do that.
No.
Oh, no, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious, too, how you kind of, how do you get Brian from Bad Religious to come and sit down and talk to you? Like, how did you get into punk rock? I'm sort of...
How did I get into punk rock? Probably listening to Public Enemy.
That's amazing.
So I think Public Enemy was sort of like the first, because I want to be clear with everyone, I don't consider like punk to necessarily mean it has to be like fast guitars, leather jackets, and mohawks or something. I think those are accoutrements of a genre, but punk to me is more of a mindset. It's an aesthetic. And Brian Baker from Bad Religion, who was on last week, he made a correlation between folk music and punk rock music. And I always felt that. And I wanted to go, oh, I think that too. But I was a little starstruck too when I was talking to him. So it's better off I didn't talk like that. But it was growing up with folk music and then getting into what it was as punk as I thought was listening to Public Enemy. And that's what set me off. And I realized in high school, specifically in high school, that you can complain about things, you could whine about the system, but unless you're willing to do something about it, you're fucked. So I, along with a couple other young cats, we decided to change the system in our high school, and that was my first taste of what the power of a punk aesthetic could be. And it was like, shit, it really wasn't quite as hard as I thought, and it was addictive and empowering. And it was like, well, we should continue to think for ourselves, question authority, and if you don't like the plan, make a new one and be prepared to suffer a little bit for it. That's my story.
That's awesome.
I'm sticking with it. Thanks for coming on, dude.
Oh my gosh, thanks so much for having me. And this was so sweet. Thank you. This is so great.
Don't show that. I didn't get anyone else a gift.
Oh my
been on the
gosh.
show.
Oh,
Put
wow.
that down. Put that down immediately. All right. Thanks for listening. Through the glass. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.